You change your perspective, you change your lens into the situation. Now all of a sudden you can see things you couldn't see before. That can also apply to so many other aspects of your life and decision making. What am I doing that's a waste of time? Yeah. What would I cancel? Which projects would I take off my plate?
So you finally did the book. How does that feel?
Feels good.
It was a long time. Like it was a long, when did you sell it?
I sold it in 2017, 2018, end of 2017, early 2018.
Yeah, because I remember we had dinner like right after you sold it, I think.
It was right after the New York Times thing came out, the profile.
Is that why it sold from that?
Yeah, because there was so much inbound. We had I didn't even have an agent. And all of a sudden I'm getting offers for like these crazy contracts.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't even know what to do.
Why do you think it took so long?
Well, I wrote it 3 times.
Why?
Because I didn't like you gave me this advice and I didn't follow it. So talk about like, there's 2 pieces of advice. One I followed and one I didn't. And they were super helpful. Yours in hindsight, because you talk about structuring the book before you start writing. I didn't do that.
Okay.
And so the process of writing it twice was like a little bit of hubris on my part, I think. And thinking that the way that I had written before would lend itself to what I was doing, and it wouldn't.
Yep.
And so the 3rd time, the first time I was like, whatever. And then, okay, this sucks. 2nd time I was like stubborn about it. 3rd time I like laid it out and I was like, oh, Ryan was right this whole time. I'm not going to tell him, but yeah.
Well, you told me. Yeah. What was the other piece of advice?
The other piece of advice was from Morgan Housel, who said, if you have like 100 units of editing time, spend like 80% of those units on the first like 50 or 60 pages of the book. And I thought that was super interesting because I guess the average person reads 17% of a book now. So if you're going to have 100 units of editing, you want to make it at the start to get momentum.
Yeah, I guess that's true. The idea is if the beginning isn't good, it doesn't matter how good the end is.
Nobody's ever going to get there.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's like one where it's like, maybe you don't tell people that one. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like in the sense that like, that's not something maybe the end consumer wants to hear about, in the same way they don't want to know that their refrigerator is going to be good for 2 years and then not good at the end. But yeah, I think.
But I apply that now to emails. If I have like 3 paragraphs in an email, I'll reread the first like 2 or 3 sentences a lot more carefully than I will the rest. So I apply that principle basically to everything now.
You have to get buy-in for any of the other stuff to matter. And I think people don't focus enough on the buy-in, and they don't focus enough on, well, what well begun is half done. Yeah. Like essentially that his advice is the articulation of that wisdom. And this is, I think, true, not just like, hey, how are you editing, but like, if it doesn't grab the person by the throat, if there isn't a reason to go from one page to another, one scene to the next, one day to the, like, if you're putting on a conference, you would think, I want the last day to be great, which you do, but the first day has to be great. And in fact, the first hour has to be good. The first minute, you would think this. And what's interesting is how it doesn't matter how much you reduce the length of the thing, the advice is still true. So like you would go, people used to make 2-hour documentaries, and now they make 10-minute YouTube videos. And then that almost feels like an eternity in a world where people make TikToks. So you go in a 60-second video, like how do you get it all in there? The first 5 seconds, or in some cases, the first 1 second is where the whole thing is won or lost. So you're thinking, like someone's thinking like, I got a minute. It's like, you don't have a minute. You have 1 fucking second. You have 1 second to capture someone's attention. And we see this like with the Daily Stoic videos, like to just accidentally, like to just riff in front of a camera and think you're going to get the first 1 second right, or the first 30 seconds or 1 minute of your YouTube video right, or the first chapter. You're not going to get it right on accident. You have to make what you're trying to do and then go back and go, does this begin in a way that gets someone?
And does it pull me through? Does it change how you write? Like in terms of like the first sentence of a paragraph, because people are skimming quicker now. So you really have to grab people to pull them into the paragraph. Whereas before you were sort of like building more of a linear.
I guess, yeah. I mean, I think about just coming out and fucking saying it, right? Like you just don't have the. Well, I think it's funny, in the online world, you know what a sales letter is, right? Like that actually doesn't work well in like a book or a video or whatever, because you're promising a payoff that's never coming. But you do have to understand how. And you go, well, what am I going to say? I have to say that up, and it has to be one good thing after another. And that's mostly why I write in stories, is that stories by definition are taking you from one point to another, where it's much it's much easier to be interested in a story than it is to be in exposition, because in exposition, your voice, your tone, your point has to do all the heavy lifting. Yeah. In a story, the characters, the curiosity gap, all of those things are working to your advantage, if that makes sense.
Totally. How do you reconcile, like, just keep the point, don't be overly verbose, with you have a 70,000 word contract or 80,000 word contract? Or
I think people think it would be hard to do that. Almost always it's the opposite. Like, did you find you were struggling to get to the end point, or did you find you were cutting stuff?
Oh, cutting a lot.
Yeah. So you think, like, I think when you're looking at the beginning of a project, you're like, how am I going to get this? How am I going to get there? And in fact, once you start out, once you've actually outlined what you're trying to do and you get it all down, it's much more a matter of, okay, what's essential here? What am I eliminating? What am I cutting? What am I refining? As opposed to like, how do I pad this to get to the end?
Well, I think I started, the original draft was over 100,000. We got it down to 60 something. I really wanted to get it down to 50 something.
So you cut 40,000 words and then you cut the other 60,000?
Yeah. Like it's so weird when you think about like what you're starting with and then chiseling down to like, where do people get lost? Where do they not want to read? Where isn't the point clear? Oh, you're making the same point later on in the book. You can get rid of that.
So you were asking me earlier, I made this decision. So I was supposed to when I sold the Four Virtues series in the fall of 2019, it was going to be 4 books in 4 years. I guess the first one was going to come out in 21. So I maybe had a little more, I'm trying to think of how that went, because I guess Lives came out first. But the idea was going to be 4 consecutive falls, 4 books about the Stoic virtues. And so I did Courage. I started writing it in the summer of 2020. It came out in the fall of 21. In the summer of 21, I started the Discipline book, which came out in the fall of 22. And then I started in the summer of 22, I started the Justice book, which was supposed to come out in the fall of 23. But sometime around maybe January of this year, I called my agent and I said, I have some ideas for some other books, which I'd like to do. And the publisher was interested in them. And I said, I'll sell them. Once we come to a deal, I'll sell them. But the other condition is that this project is going to get a year. I was like, if I'm going to be basically booked up for this whole period, I need at least 1 year off. So it ultimately is going to be about 18 months, like, because it was starting in January. I moved it to the following, right? Yeah. It was a break, which has been really good. I just did, I had more time, right? Just generally not writing. So I just did a lot more family stuff and took some trips. We did stuff that was great. But then actually the process of like refining and sort of simmering it down, I got basically a year to do instead of 4 months to do. And so I probably cut maybe 10,000 words out of an approved manuscript. Like the book was done and ready to go into production, more or less, hadn't been copy edited. But then, so to take 10,000 words out of that but I was able to do it. It's a
huge chunk.
Yeah. I mean, it's 1/7 of the book, right? Yeah. Or 1/8 of the book I cut. And so ironically, you cut the 10 and then I probably added 7,500 back in of different other stuff that just I wouldn't have done without the time. But it was just the decision to take more time and to not be rushed and to create space was a big sort of lifestyle decision that ended up making the final product, I think, much better, which after we're done, I have to go up and do a couple more tweaks, and then it's going in.
Did it change your process, or did it just change the amount of time? I'm thinking of like Parkinson's law, right? Where you're editing just to fill the time versus like, well,
when Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, he wrote it and then he was like, this will come out in January. And he's supposedly fiddled and adjusted with it on a fairly regular basis. It wasn't this like on his desk working on it every day thing, but a word change here or there, a sentence that needs to be added, a way of explaining it. It's just kind of letting it age in a way that's positive. So yeah, I mean, let's say I'd done that 18-month process in 4 months. Would I have gotten 80% of it done? Probably.
Yeah.
And would it have been easier in some sense? Yes. But I wanted it spread out over 18 months because it was easier over 18. Like I wanted to mostly I was not thinking about this book, but I was thinking about pushing out the start date of the next one. I just wanted space. And discipline came out of the gate much stronger than maybe anyone thought. And so there was also some idea of like, why don't we just let it do its thing instead of stepping on it with another one?
Yeah.
So there's like a bunch of reasons for it, but like I'm trying to do things a bit more slowly now. But yeah, I think there's a tension. Like, I mean, so that was what, five years you did this?
Well, COVID in there too. I didn't do much during COVID.
But I was going to ask, it took 5 years, but how much of that do you feel like you were working? So the process probably could have been compressed.
The last copy of the book was like 6 months of writing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was one of those things. There's that Lincoln quote, which probably isn't true, where he's like, if I have to chop down a tree, I'll spend 3 hours sharpening the axe. Do you think that's what it was, or do you think like you would just do it differently next time? You would have.
I would do the process differently. So I have 2 other ideas for books, and I'm like, before I do anything with them, I'm like much more conscious of like, what would the structure of that book look like? What resources do I need at hand to make the writing process a lot easier? How do I weave things together in a different way? So having written a book, I think about it differently. I don't know if I'll ever write another book. I have 2 ideas though.
Well, why do you think you were because it seems like plan it out before you do it is pretty basic, not objectionable.
I didn't say I was like
this. But why didn't you want to do it?
Well,
I'm curious what your resistance was.
I had it planned out. I just didn't have it planned out like in detail, right? Like I'm like, I want to talk about this topic, this topic. But what I really needed to do is like, here, how do I organize this? What do the chapters look like? What are the points that I want to include? Yeah, that I didn't do that.
But why? That's why because I think that's a very common thing, right? Like it's like, hey, if you're going to do this thing, here's this process you have to follow, right? We all look to someone who's done a thing that we're trying to do before, and they tell us, and it's only afterwards like, oh, that's why you told us. So I'm curious if you can isolate why you think.
Well, I think most of my writing was under like 3,000 words for one. So like all the blog writing we've done or I've done is well read. Never a plan for what to write other than maybe an opening sentence and a conclusion. And then the process of writing is the process by which I figure out what I want to say.
Sure.
And figure out what I know and what I don't know, and then get new ideas.
Yeah.
All of those things. And through that process, I end up with this really good article. And I think with the book, I sort of felt like I could do the same thing.
Right.
With chapters and with sections, and I couldn't, and I was stumbling on it. And you know how one of the big problems in life is perspective. Like I only see what's in front of me. Like had I been watching me write this, or you've been watching me write this, you'd be like, Shane, you're an idiot. Like you need to plan this out before you start writing. And it makes so much sense. But when you're in the moment, that's all you see. It's hard to get out of that. And the second time was pure stubbornness. Like I sort of knew I should have been doing it, but I was like, no, this is how I've always written.
Every day I send out one Stoic inspired email to hundreds of thousands of people all over the world. If you want more Stoic wisdom in your inbox, you can sign up at dailystoic.com/email. It's totally free. You can unsubscribe at any time. We'd love to have you. dailystoic.com/email.
I bet there's two things there. One is like sometimes we identify with how we've done things in the past. So it's like I got to be lean or simple, or I bootstrapped all my stuff in the past, or like I don't want to be too rehearsed, right? We have this sense of like it was easy and flowing and natural and authentic how we were doing it before, and we're scared that a process or a system or somebody else's way of doing it
will
change that. And I think that's a good thing to have a little bit of an aversion to. But I imagine what you really bumped into, and I think this is also transferable to domains far outside writing books, is you were dealing with something at first that was manageable or conceivable by a single person in a relatively snap way.
Yeah.
And you were transitioning towards a project that was much larger in scope that really you can't have all in your head. It's like the difference in I designed this shed for my backyard doing, sort of rough estimates. And now I'm trying to build a cathedral.
Yeah.
Like you need to have a whole different, there's all these things. And so you have to ask yourself, hey, is this like a small project or a big sort of multi-phase, multi-part, multi-person thing? And ask yourself, is like the system or the scaffolding that was able to do that first one, is it sufficient for this much larger task? And realizing that, hey, I'm about to tackle something that I can't conceive from beginning to end at once because I've never done it before and it's too big for me, is kind of an awareness that we have to have going into stuff. It's the difference between a battle and a campaign.
I think that's a great way to think about it. As you were saying that, one thing that came to mind is like, I think we learn through, I call it the learning loop. We have an experience, we reflect on that experience, we create a compression, and that compression leads to an action in the future. And I'm used to writing basically my compression.
Yeah.
And what I was really doing during the process of the book is like going back to the reflection stage, pulling out bits of the experience that I think that the reader wants to use and would add context and value to them.
Yeah.
And that's part of what made it hard too, is because I'm going backwards in my head for a lot of things that have just become subconscious, because it's like you have this experience and it's like 5 gigabytes, but your brain's not going to store 5 gigabytes. Yeah. It's going to store like 1 megabyte. And so that megabyte is usually how we talk. It's also how we consume, right? Like Twitter is all about those 1 megabytes. Yeah, it's all about the compression, but the real value comes from the reflection.
Yeah.
And so how do you give the reader the reflection so that they're actually learning and they can take away and implement stuff?
Well, I think this is why a lot of like people who are popular on social media, or YouTube or podcasts, even, like the reason they don't succeed when they go into books, or the reason why someone who writes books doesn't succeed when they go into why domain expertise doesn't transfer, is that, I think one is they're not learning how one medium works with another. And then the other is because they don't realize in the way that they have been supported by the medium that they're in, and the medium they're going into is asking for more, right? So it's like, hey, you think you've been writing 5,000 word pieces on Medium. Like I know one writer who's really good at Medium, who's write these big Medium pieces. And so in your head you go, well, this is 10 of those pieces. I can do that in my sleep. And you don't realize that actually, no, it's one large thing. And you're gonna have to you're gonna have to be able to conceive of that one large thing, but also that thing to be able to stand up on its own has to be conceived from start to finish and operate under the logic of the medium that you're entering in. And you need to have the chops to actually do that. And you think you have the chops, but you don't. You haven't built the chops to like, it's like, hey, I write scripts. There's a difference between writing movie scripts and a 10 season television show. Yeah. They're just fundamentally different expressions.
To use your sort of analogy earlier, it's like just because you built 10 sheds doesn't mean you can build an office building.
Yes, right. Yes. And you have to, it's actually good to be intimidated by the fact, like you have to respect the office building, right? You have to go, this is a thing that I'm starting effectively at zero at, and I have to figure out how office buildings work and more importantly, why do office buildings fail? Like, what makes a bad office building? What makes a great office building? And you really have to figure out what is being demanded of the canvas or the medium that you're going into, and then you have to come up with something that works for that. It's not, well, I'm just going to multiply what I'm doing by 5 or 10 or whatever. It's so much more than that.
So what in your mind makes for good writing and a good book, specifically a good book? Because one thing like I tried to avoid is I'm like, what books don't I like? And one book I don't like is like the book where you read the intro and you basically know the rest of the book. And then every chapter is
the big
just
idea
like
book, yeah.
a story about you reinforce. So you're not getting anything new. And what do I tend to like? I like books where like every page I'm like learning something new or highlighting something or thinking about something, or it clicks in a different way.
Yeah.
So I wanted to write a book where every page, every couple of pages, you should be getting insights, practical, that are useful, that connect things possibly and hopefully in new ways for people. And you can read to the end of the book and not feel like it's a repetition over and over again.
Sure. Well, look, you didn't do yourself any favors when you picked this topic, because the topic is inherently ephemeral and hard to define.
It's crazy.
Do you know what I mean? Like habits, it's very clear, right? Or how to overcome obstacles, or how to do something about ego or discipline. These are much clearer things than thinking clearly, right? Because what does that look like? Who are the exemplars of that? How do you know when you're doing it, and how do you know when you're not? You picked a hard topic, and that's probably why, perhaps an easier topic, you could have gotten away with not outlining, right? Because you would have been able to define it much more clearly, and that's probably why it was tough.
I remember you actually appear in the book a little bit in terms of hard mode or easy mode. And I don't know if you remember, we were in Sedona together, and I was talking about self-publishing.
Yeah.
The Great Mental Models books, which
are super popular in the bookstore, by the way.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. So we self-published them, and you just looked at me and you're like, Shane, you don't have to do everything on hard mode. He's like, you're literally, you're being a publisher, right? You're creating content, you're designing it, you're going out to designers, you're getting custom images, you got a layout team, you got a printer, you got to ship them, you got to store them, you got to feed them through this beast, you got to maintain inventory, you got to put up all this money. And you just looked at me and you just shook your head and you're like, you don't have to do this on hard mode.
Yeah, that's funny. Although, and then I think I remember shortly after that conversation, I was like, by the way, I have this idea for a bookstore. And you were like, gave me the exact same advice, which is like, don't do it. It's going to be really hard and not worth it. Which I'm glad that I actually didn't listen to. But yeah, I think sometimes you're doing, like, it's important. I think people realize, like, you don't really get to pick what you are called to do. Yeah. And sometimes you're called to do a really straightforward down the middle thing, and sometimes you're not. And having some clarity about that is actually really important, because, sometimes you're picking voluntary hardships that actually you don't need to do. Like the difference between, let's say, self-publishing and traditionally publishing. Or, just some people are very picky and finicky, and they get tied up in like details that are not moving the needle, but are making things much more difficult than they are. And then other times, what you're excited about, what's meaningful to you, is perhaps the less marketable thing or the less immediately accessible thing. And you're going to get advice from people where they're trying to steer you towards the easier thing. Yeah. And if you don't have clarity with yourself and your motives about why you're doing it, that advice can be hard to resist. And weirdly, you'll end up really fucking yourself and the project by like kind of trying to do both at the same time. Yeah. Because like it's just a problem. So you have to know, like, this is why I think outlining is important, and clarity and meditating on this stuff is so important, because you got to go, here's what I'm trying to do. Here's why I'm trying to do it. Here's what it's supposed to look like. So then when someone comes along and says, well, what if you did this for this reason? You can know, does that get me closer or further away from what I'm trying to do? Yeah. Like, how do you integrate feedback? Actually, the wrong question. That's kind of the wrong question. You first have to know what you're trying to do, so then you can know what feedback to listen to and what feedback to ignore.
Well, I think there's value to doing the hard thing, right? Like there's value to sort
Sometimes.
of like diving into these subjects if you want to learn about them.
Yeah.
And you want to learn about them at depth. Like you
Yeah.
can only learn so much from other people. You have to like get your hands dirty and struggle with things. And,
Sure.
As long as you're willing to take on that battle, then there's a lot of learning in that. Like you've probably learned a ton about operating a bookstore.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's probably made you a better writer.
It's made me a more disciplined writer. It's taught me a lot. Yeah, for sure. And also though, it was like, I was trying, like for the same amount of work that went into starting, funding, whatever, I could have just started a company that probably would have the potential for exponential returns of some kind. But I wasn't interested in doing that.
Yeah,
like
you weren't doing it for financial reasons.
Yes.
Yeah.
So when you know what you're trying to do, and more importantly, why you're trying to do it and where it fits into your life, then you can know whether that advice is good or not, I think.
Yeah, totally. But you have to like dive in and do the thing to really figure it out too. Like you have these ideas about how things work. And, you know, I had ideas about publishing and then I created a publishing company. And, you know, I've really got to know publishing quite a bit.
Yes.
And it's helped me in other areas of life too.
Sure.
But I don't know if I would do it again.
Self-publish them or write a book again?
Oh, self-publish.
Yes. Yeah. I've said that because I self-published these 2 kids' books. And the reason I self-published them was not because my traditional publisher wasn't interested in them. They were, but they wanted it to be a different book to fit with like they wanted it to be like basically a young adult novel, and I wanted to write a fable. And so knowing again why I was doing it, it was like, yes, you're offering me more money and the ease of not having to do any of this stuff myself, but it would defeat the purpose of doing it, which is this is the story that I have in me right now.
That's the exact same reason we ended up self-publishing the Great Mental Models books. Though we wanted a certain level of quality and a certain level of product that we couldn't get guaranteed at that point in time through traditional publishers.
Right.
And it wasn't about the words, because the words would be relatively the same. It was the paper quality, it was the binding, and they were like, we can't do that profitably unless we charge like $60 a book.
Right.
And I was like, I just want to break even on the books. Like I don't even want to make money on the books. I just want to get these ideas out in the world and give them to people. But I really want to create this high quality product because that's going to be a lot of people's first contact with our brand as Farnam Street and our company and me as a person. And so I want that to be a high quality experience.
Yes. I don't remember the specifics, but I think there was some stuff you're doing that seemed like it was needlessly painful, if I remember.
Printing our own books, shipping them, storing them, warehousing.
Yes.
And then our first distributor goes bankrupt, right? Like during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And like there's hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in the book warehouse that we have no access to that all of a sudden seemingly belong to the bank.
Oh,
and I was like, what? Just give me my books back. And they're like, no, you can buy them. And I'm like, I already bought them. I printed them. Like,
I think so also realize, I think sometimes people will go, the profits are better this way than this way, right? Like if you look at the math, self-publishing is much better than traditional publishing. Except what are you optimizing for is the question, right? Is it actually, when you dig in, when you really do it, you go, actually the math is not as good as you think once you calculate risk and a bunch of other factors into the equation. But going, what did I set out to do here, right? And was optimizing for profit my primary motivation? No, it wasn't. And then once you have that, it's clarifying then when you come up to individual decisions, because the default is, well, what is cheaper, right? Or what makes the most money? And like you already told yourself, it's like you're not getting the message from yourself that that's actually not what's important to you. So you end up making these individual decisions. This goes to the ideas in the book, like because you didn't have enough clarity when you were beginning, you're then making these individual decisions that are not adding up to the ballpark of where you wanted to go. Yes, you're perhaps being more profitable, but it's coming at this great expense in this other way. And so having that sense is really important.
Well, you're sort of like winning the moment and losing the decade.
Yes, sure.
And I think we often make those trade-offs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's as simple as like when you eat a chocolate bar,
yes.
You do that once, you're not going to get fat and overweight, but you repeat that choice day after day.
You're not thinking how you're going to feel 2 weeks from now.
Or even 20 minutes.
Yes.
Because 20 minutes from now, you're going to crash and you're going to have this sugar high, and then you're going to be lethargic and you're not going to pay as much attention. you're not going to be as engaged.
Yeah.
And you think about it year after year, day after day, the same thing.
I saw a commercial many years ago that illustrated that in a way that I think about all the time. It's like these people are sitting in a restaurant and the waiter comes with the check and it's like $100. And the guy says, I'd rather pay $170. And then this conceit happens over and over again. You know, this car is $20,000, and then it's like, actually, I'd prefer to pay $30. And basically, what they were illustrating was like when you just put things on your credit card, what it actually is costing you, right? What it's costing. Like we tend to think, hey, what is the price tag on this thing? Not what, like we don't think, for instance, that you're paying with post-tax earnings. So what did it actually cost you? What did you have to earn to be able to pay for it? That's one kind of blind spot we don't have. But we don't think of the costs that come along with something, right? The cost of ownership, whether that's insurance or maintenance, time, opportunity costs, financing costs, right? Like you think your house costs $200,000, but the mortgage statement in very small, numbers towards the end tells you what your end cost of the house will be. And it's several times that over 30 years of interest. Yeah. And so we're not good at calculating those hidden fees that are being tacked on to what we're doing. So we're thinking, hey, I'm pulling one over on the industry by self-publishing this book, or, by building the deck myself, or whatever it is, right? Like we have these ideas that we're getting the better end of the deal, but that's just because we're obscuring from view all the things that it's costing us. Like one of the ones my wife and I talk about is like, we're thinking about doing this thing. Maybe it's a cool opportunity, maybe it's a trip, maybe it's an investment, whatever. We're going, what is the cost to our marriage? Right? Like, is this the thing that but the one I fast forward to is I go, when we get divorced, do I look back and say, we got divorced because we decided to remodel the house for no fucking reason? And we just fought endlessly about it. And in retrospect, the potential upside of it going, like that was a silly thing to trade something priceless for, right? And so if you're thinking about those costs, it allows you, I think, to make better decisions as you go.
Yeah, we're so prone to thinking about things in material, like something quantifiable. But a large part of the cost of things isn't necessarily quantifiable. It's the stress on your marriage, to talk about that, right? The time commitment. Well, you don't know how many hours you're going to be involved with architects and designers. You're going to have to leave the store and go deal with something and an issue. And we just tend to think, oh, it's going to cost X dollars. Yeah. And I'll tack on 30% because contractors are usually off. And then I have a ballpark of like the cost. But like you said, we're not thinking through the invisible sort of costs. Opportunity costs, time, all these things that...
Because when you look at people and they've ended up somewhere they don't want to be, right? They can usually, and we have to be careful about stories, but they can usually tell themselves a story where they trace back a seemingly small decision. Like, why are you very out of shape? Well, I took on this new job and I just started working a ton and I was getting stressed, and so it's like they made this decision to accept a raise and a promotion that was a 5% increase in income and maybe 5% increase in status or whatever, that came at a 40% cost to their health, right? Yeah. And so you like the ability to sort of think about how this is going to translate in a larger way across your life in all the different ways that you measure yourself is, to me, the kind of the definition of wisdom, the ability to go, if I do this, what are the downstream consequences of this decision? And we and people are extremely bad at that.
One way to look at that is imagine your life being a mosaic. And the most important parts are, like health, community, your relationship, work, all of these things. And you pick your own parts, right? Yeah. But you put them in this sort of, and they take on different shapes and sizes. Yeah. And so you can think through the impact of one choice on the different sizes of the other parts of it. Mm-hmm. Whereas like releasing a book, I went to the kids, it was like, hey, it's going to be really busy for 3 months. Yeah. Like work is going to be a bigger piece of this mosaic.
Sure.
And then we're going to shrink it back down to where it was before.
Right.
And that's natural and normal. And sometimes that happens. And sometimes like you're going to be the biggest part of this puzzle. Well, they're always technically the biggest part, but like, sometimes we're going to be doing things that are like more intense. We're going to go away for vacation. Well, that's me and you two together, three of us. Well, that's going to be a huge piece, and work is going to be a smaller piece during that time.
Sure.
And so it helps me to think through some of the impacts on various parts, because I can't change the size of the box.
Yeah.
I can only change the size of the pieces, and you can't ever let them go to zero.
Yeah.
So health, community, sort of relationships with your partner, your kids, your family, work, like all of these things need to integrate to create your life.
But let's go back to this mosaic thing, because it's actually a good, I think, analogy for doing a book. Let's say you were doing a mosaic of a snake or, two gladiators fighting, some like ancient Roman mosaic. You would never, like if someone's like, Shane, what are you working on? You'd be like, I'm making a mosaic. And they're like, they would know, because it would need to be sketched out. Like you would never just be like, I'm making it as I go, because there's all these tiny, like it's tiny pieces of glass that cumulatively thousands, hundreds of thousands of them would go into just an arm or a sword or an animal, right? And so you have to have the whole thing drawn out, and then you're knowing where each one is going, right? Or else you're going to put something here that makes it impossible for that thing to go there. And so that ability to conceive of the whole, and this is true for projects, but also for life. Like if you don't have a good sense of what you want your life to look at like, then you're not able to evaluate decisions properly, which is, hey, we'd like you to come, take this important position in Washington, or hey, this company is offering this big contract, or if you don't have a sense of where everything you're doing fits into a large whole of what you want your life to be and what's actually important to you, you're just going to be like, well, this thing is offering more money than that thing, or this thing seems cool, or this is the only offer that I've gotten recently. And so you make these things, and then all of a sudden you made this choice. Yeah. And then again, that explains why your health fell apart, why your marriage fell apart, why you feel X, Y, or Z. How did I end up here? Well, I just accepted this thing and I didn't think about how it fits into this larger mosaic of my life.
And that's why the last chapter of the book is sort of around that, which is it's one thing to get what you want, and it's a completely other thing to know what's worth wanting in the first place.
Yes,
and sure. I've worked with so many people, and I'm sure you know quite a few, who sort of get to their mid 60s, early 70s, and realize that they've just chased sort of the wrong goals, and the cost becomes very apparent at that point in time. Or not even chasing the wrong goals, because I have no judgment on that. They're unconsciously pursuing something they haven't thought about.
Yes, and then and now that they've thought about it more, it didn't do for them what they thought it was going to do. So it's not, you're right, it's not a moral judgment. They are saying, I got it, and it's not what I wanted.
Or I got it in a way that was mutually exclusive from meaning. So I still wanted to pursue the same goal, but the way that I went about pursuing that goal, like if you think of a prototypical, CEO who comes up in a sharp elbows environment, the way that I accomplished, and I worked with somebody like this who basically went from everybody wanted to play golf with him to quitting to nobody wanted to talk to him, because the way that he accomplished all these things was mutually exclusive from meaningful relationships with other people.
Right.
And all of his relationships were transactional, and he didn't realize that until he quit. And then nobody's returning his phone call anymore, and nobody's, and then it sort of dawned on him slowly that like the way that I wanted to be CEO, that doesn't change. He was conscious about that, but the way that he accomplished that goal was not the way that he would have pursued it had he had a redo.
The way he purchased the thing was more expensive in retrospect than it seemed at the time. He was thinking, this is the expedient way to get what I want, or perhaps he thought it was the only way to get what he wanted, and he didn't realize that it was pushing other things that he would want or need in the future further out of grasp.
And we lie to ourselves. We justify sometimes these actions, right? He was telling me some stories early in his career about how he, and this was post, so he reflected a lot on this, about how he stepped on somebody basically to get ahead of them. And what he would tell himself was, I'll make it up to them. Right. And what we don't realize is that when you have a relationship that's win-lose with people, you can't really ever get it back to where it was. Or if you do, it's like a huge Herculean effort And if you think of sort of 4 permutations of relationships, there's win-win, win-lose, lose-win, and lose-lose. But only one of those relationships survives across time.
Yeah.
And that's a win-win relationship. So the minute somebody's losing, if you're on the losing end, we feel this, right? Like if we're forced to use somebody for a service that we don't want to use, we're looking for an out. We're looking for a competitor. We can't wait to find a new. It doesn't mean that we take action that day. It's like we're this negatively coiled spring, though. We're just waiting for something to happen. And I think, we create these little, and it's sediment, right? So that's one relationship, but that relationship builds up over time.
Sure.
And then you have this huge weight that you have to overcome, not only with you and justification of how you're living, but also these people are, they're not your friends. They're not telling you things getting in your way. They're not giving you information that you should have. You actually become a less effective person because of it.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the paradox of life, or most lives, is that we know where we want to end up, which is we want to be admired and respected and generous and kind and like we want to be a good, virtuous person. But we think that in order to succeed or to get to the point where we have the luxury of being those things, we have to basically do the opposite of those things, right? Like,
and then all of a sudden we'll change, right?
Yes, which of course never happens.
Yeah.
And like, you want to be that leader who is selfless and thinks big picture and, puts other things ahead of other, you want to be all that, but then you're like, but if I don't throw sharp elbows, if I don't,
then I can't get ahead.
Yeah. And I won't, and it's very hard to become something by doing the opposite of that thing, right? Well, so that's, Aristotle goes, virtue is not this thing that you possess. Virtue is a thing that you do. You do not become a house builder, he says. You build houses. You don't become a flute player. You learn how to, and then you play the flute. So it's basically this idea that it's something you do, not something you are. But by doing it, you are that thing. And the converse is true. If you're an asshole, now you're going to end up an asshole. You're not going to do asshole-ish, selfish things or dishonest things or cutting corner things. You're not going to do that and then end up in a place where you are not that thing. That's not how it works. It seems obvious, but almost everyone at the outset of their career / life makes some version of that rationalization to themselves. But
it's never with something black and white, right? Like it's always a slow progression into this. Like if you think about how a big organization works, your promotion to be a team leader, and what are they looking for? They're looking for people like them. So it's like this slow change. And as you work your way up the ranks, you don't even recognize yourself anymore.
Yeah.
And you become the very person that you were thinking, oh, they don't get it. They're making bad decisions. They don't treat people very well.
Yeah.
And had the contrast been that stark on day one, you would have said no to the opportunity. But there's 100 steps in between here and there. And at each step, you're rewarded with money, with praise, with all these other things, and then you slowly change. It's almost, it brings to mind the frog in the boiling water, which I don't know if it's actually real or not, but if you put a frog in boiling water, it jumps out. But if you boil the water slowly, it doesn't. And I feel like that's what happens to us in organizations. If we're unconscious about how we're acting or thinking or the life we want to live or the way that we want to be.
Yeah, I mean, so this expression, character is fate, that's what it means. Like you are what you do. So if you do dishonest things, you're going to end up a dishonest person, right? That's what that idea means. Like the sort of character traits or the values that you set for yourself are deterministic in the sense that they determine the individual decisions you make, which determine the cumulative impact of where you end up. So like it's funny how as a society, we are always surprised, right? We go like, why isn't this CEO, like wildly innovative or take big risks? Well, how do you think they worked for 20 years at this company before they got promoted? You think they were taking wild, huge, risky swings and that's what got them promoted? No, they were going along with the way things are. This is what politicians do. The process of working your way through the system is also working on you, right? So you're doing what you think you need to do to survive, but actually what you're doing is remaking yourself in the image of the system or the society that you're in. And then you wonder why the end result is you're like everyone else, or you're not the good person you would want to be. Well, it's at these individual juncture points, you were predetermining that outcome.
How do you change your character? Like, it can't just be a matter of, I want to be a good person, therefore I will become a good person. Like, how in the moment do you, okay, well, this situation calls for honesty and it's not black and white. It's really hard for me to do. How do I make sure, like, how do I go about doing that? How do I teach that to my kids? How do I?
I mean, yeah, it's a tricky thing, because when we go character is fate, it's very obvious we see this in other people. Like, Kyrie Irving is not going to change, right? Like, the idea that it's going to work out at the next team, it's not. But it would be sad if we saw that about ourselves, right? And we have to accept that. It's like this weird kind of paradox of like, other people are what they are. You got to accept that, and you're going to fool yourself if you think they're going to be different. And then you can't give up on yourself and your ability to change. And I feel like I went through a change, like my 20s were mostly about me, mostly about succeeding. And I found myself in environments where I did things that in retrospect, I'm like, why was that an environment that I was trying to succeed in? Why was I willing to do that? Why was I not acting with sort of virtues or values that I now hold to be important, or that I would like my children to
Why didn't I have the wisdom of my 30-year-old self in my 20s?
But I think a big part of that was, one, it's knowledge, like you don't know. But two, it, like James Clear talks about this with the habits, like you have to decide to be someone who eats well or runs or works out. This has to be a conscious identity shift that you make first. And then you have to make individual decisions that reinforce that identity. So like, you want to be the leader who makes hard, right decisions, right? Like the expensive but moral choices, right? That we want to see other CEOs or leaders do and they don't. Well, the idea that you're going to be faced with this one singular big decision where your life or your career or your future's on the line and you choose the hard, right thing, that's incredibly naive. That's not how it goes. You have to build the muscle of making those individual decisions as you go. Like if you want to be the leader that says, we're pulling out of Russia because we don't want to be complicit in what's happening. It's very hard if you're the company that's been making, bottom line shareholder value, profit only decisions up until this point. And then now you are the head of a $6 billion company and you're supposed to light 50% of the business on fire. You haven't built the strength to do that.
We're seeing that with a lot of university presidents and anti-Semitic behavior right now. Mm-hmm. And the lack of calling it out is...
You haven't been in these individual culture hot button issues. You were like, I'll give this side what they want. Over here, you're like, I'll give this side. I don't want to be involved. I'll hide behind press release. And then this big moment happens and you don't have the balls, you don't have the skills, you don't have the support, you don't have the reputation, you don't have any of the things that you need to make that hard decision.
Part of it, and I don't know if this is right, I'd love to hear your take on this, is I'm not, and it's unconscious, I don't think people are consciously thinking of it. They're not able to handle the pain of taking a stand. And the pain is people are going to, people on one side are going to be pissed off, or the other side.
Yeah.
You're going to get a whole bunch of hate mail or whatever you want to call it. You have to be able to withstand this emotionally. And I think we're not strong enough these days, or a lot of people aren't strong enough to go through this. So financial pain is like one thing, but like this is a different type of,
sure.
You might lose your job.
Yeah.
Are you willing to take a stand on something and lose your job over it? Can you go through that? Are you prepared to go through that? And this is some of the stuff that you talk about.
Yeah. And you'd think it'd be transferable, right? Like I interviewed Adam Kinzinger, who sat in that chair, and we were talking about there's multiple war heroes in Congress. So they put their physical body, their life on the line for abstract principles, and for which their courage and selflessness is unquestionable. It's almost unfathomable that they were able to do what they did. And then someone comes in and says, my inauguration was the biggest inauguration there's ever been. And they're like, yep, yes, sir, sure, whatever you say, right? Yeah. And it's this process of getting of these small cowardly decisions, which then ultimately culminate in the inability to go, I would prefer to do the right thing more than I would prefer to remain in the job that I have. And so you'd think it would be transferable, right? If you had incredible physical courage, that you would be able to have moral courage, but it can atrophy. And then also where it's clear and concise in one domain, it doesn't transfer as well because maybe you don't see it that way, or maybe you identify more with material success than you identify with, like, for you, perhaps ego death is scarier than actual death. And that seems crazy, but like there's not really another explanation for it. So it's something you have to practice, but then it's also something you have to step back and go, like, what are my values here? And is the decision I'm making in line with those values or not in line with those values? As opposed to, I think a lot of it is they're just sort of caught up in the news. Like if we're talking politics specifically, they're just caught up in the news cycle, and they think this is a trap, or this is giving the other side what they want.
I call that like leading by polling.
Yes. Right. Or they're just thinking the other side, I know what the other side wants me to do here, so I'm just not going to do that.
I'm going to do the opposite.
Yeah. Instead of going, hey, I still hate the other, like I still think the other side is wrong on 90% of things. And I don't like them. And I know that they don't like me. And I know they only want me to do this because they think it's humiliating me, or that's humiliating our opponent. But like, I'm doing it not for those reasons. I'm doing it because the other thing is unthinkably wrong or unjustifiable.
So I don't know if you'd ever get to the, like, even the primary race if you took that stance, but imagine somebody in power doing that and being like, no, like, I mean, that idea is a better idea than what we had. We're just going to do that. What do you think would happen?
Well, great politicians do that, right? Like,
but do you think they'd ever even get to that point to become a great politician?
It's true,
now?
right? To be that is the process, right? The process of running for first the party system obviously incentivizes, but this. Oh, these are the positions I'm supposed to have. Sure, I'll have those if that's what it gets me elected.
Right.
Then when you're elected, you're supposed to suddenly be like, but I'm swapping those in for these. Like, it's not how it works, right? And so it's tough. It's really tough. It's really tough. And yet it's tougher on another level because idealists and purists don't accomplish anything either. Mm-hmm. And so pragmatism is this incredibly difficult thing. I talk about this in the Justice book that I'm doing now. So Jimmy Carter, the day he's elected governor of Georgia, he gets up, he gives his inauguration speech, and he basically opens with it. He runs like a sort of a typical Southern Democrat campaign. And then he gets up and he says, by the way, the time for racial discrimination in this state is over. It ends now. And people were like, what? Like, it was the opposite of what he campaigned on, and it shocked everyone. Now, the sort of dirty secret there is Georgia governors at that time could only serve a single term. And so he actually was being somewhat pragmatic. It didn't matter, right? You save it till later or not. Then Carter wins the presidency in a sort of surprise moment. Literally the first meeting that Carter has after he's elected, it's like 3:35, the day of his inauguration, is with a disabled veteran from Vietnam he asked to be the head of his Veterans Affairs Division, and says, I want you to work on a memo which is a blanket pardon for anyone who evaded serving in Vietnam. And many people trace his not getting a second term to that decision that he made on his first day in office. And the point being, had he saved that for his second term, what might he have been able to accomplish? And so there is some argument that part of what makes Carter not the great president that, in retrospect, he actually was capable of being, because he's a very smart man, clearly a decent man, and actually a good politician, that he could have done better, but he didn't because he had this sort of purity treat. Like, he says, I don't care if everyone in the Senate is against me, it's the right thing to do. And it was the right thing to do. Now, he would say that actually that is the pragmatic move. Because you don't know you're going to get, the idea of deferring to your second term is kind of an idealistic thing too, right? You think you're being pragmatic and practical, but you don't know you're going to get a second term. So his point was, I'm president now. I'm going to do all the things that I can do as a president now because no future is guaranteed.
How do you distinguish between pragmatism and something more blanket like the ends justify the means?
It's tricky. It's because it's a spectrum, right? It's a spectrum, right? You have ends justify the means, you have pragmatism, and then you have this sort of moral purity. Like, it's funny that people sometimes get mad at me for talking about the Stoics or for talking about politics because they're like, just tell me about the Stoics. As if the Stoics weren't inherently political. I mean, Marcus Aurelius is emperor, Seneca is a senator, he's a consul, Cato is a senator. Like the Stoics not only hold public office, but like they say it's part of Stoicism. Seneca says, you should only not be involved in politics if something prevents you. He's like, a Stoic has to be involved. So the Stoics were inherently political, but it's interesting. Cato, the purest and the sort of most moral of the Stoics, is probably the worst politically. Like he's so...
But that makes sense.
He's so conservative in the lowercase c sense of it, like things should be the way they've always been, that his inability to compromise with Caesar, which there's a difference between compromising and collaborating, his inability to understand that Caesar represents a force and a constituency and also has certain intentions, that his inability to adjust and to anticipate and sort of jujitsu that energy ultimately empowers Caesar to do what he did. There's this famous scene where Pompey returns from, basically becoming Pompey the Great. He's the great conqueror. And he comes back to Rome and he's going to enter politics. And someone says, like, Cato is the greatest man in Rome. You should ally with Cato. And so Pompey proposes a marriage alliance that he would marry like Cato's niece or daughter, something like this. We don't know the specifics. But, and Cato's family's like, this is an amazing idea. We like the women, just so we're not talking about consent here, they're into the idea. And Cato says, I will not be acquired through my female relatives. He turns down the alliance. So what does Pompey do? He allies with Caesar instead. And Plutarch goes, the irony here is that because of Cato's purity, he brings about the one thing that he
didn't want to happen,
believed was the worst thing that could happen. Right. He drives his potential ally into the arms of his opponent. And so that is the problem with politics, with justice, with life. Like, it's one thing to be pure and idealistic and clear about your sense of right and wrong. Then you have to understand that you live in reality. Caesar tries to...
messy.
Yeah, Cicero goes, Cato, you don't live in Plato's Republic. He says you live in the dregs of Romulus. And that inability to go, how can I pragmatically and realistically get the most of what I'm trying to do, as opposed to I want everything that I want or nothing, is a really... a masterful skill that not enough good people have.
But I guess it still sort of like begs the question, at what point is it pragmatism towards a better end? And what point is it I'm justifying the means?
Well, you flash forward a generation and Seneca is in exile and has been driven out of power. He's in the middle of nowhere. He's miserable. And he gets this offer to come back to Rome if he tutors this young prince. And so he says, yes, of course. And that young prince is a promising boy named Nero. And at first, he thinks, this is my chance to influence this guy to become a great leader. But it becomes increasingly clear with time that Nero is not remotely qualified or well-suited to wear the purple, to be the emperor. He's insane, and he's an egomaniac, and he's delusional, and he's bad and evil. He's all these things. And so we can imagine Seneca perhaps even thinking of the example of Cato and going, look, if I leave, someone worse will do it. Like this isn't, I don't live in Plato's Republic. I live in Rome. And he tells himself, I'm the adult in the room. I'm making it less bad. But at what point does this supervision or this constraint become a form of complicity?
Yeah.
And I would argue right around the time that Nero tries to kill his own mother. You know, like there were these bright line moments that Seneca ignores.
But you don't see those bright, and like I'm just mapping this to
Sure.
real life, right? Like if he walks in and on day one, Nero like tries to kill his mother, he's like, I'm out.
Yes.
But because he's involved, because he's invested, and every day he's investing in this, he's got more at stake too, right? Like he wants a different
It's death
outcome.
by 1,000 cuts, right? No, you think they're going to come to you with an envelope full of money and say, I want you to do a 180 on all your beliefs for this exchange of goods or services or whatever. Or, hey, if you do X, I will make you Y, right? We even think of this now. We go, this politician's a foreign agent, or they've been, and there are examples where someone's corruption is so blatant and clear, but that's more the exception. It's much more like, now I'm in the in group and I don't want to not be in the in group.
Yeah.
I don't want to lose what I have.
Yeah.
Or it's even more insidious, which is, Seneca is probably telling himself with Nero that like the person who comes after me will be worse. And he's not wrong.
Yeah.
Like the person who comes after him probably will be worse.
Yeah.
And so it really is this tricky decision of like, where is that line? How long can one go? And it becomes very unclear.
You have to be willing to take a stand, I guess, with yourself, and not, even if you're doing the right things, nobody's going to clap for you.
Yes.
And nobody's going to give you, and nobody's even going to understand. You understand it because you're involved in the situation and you see it differently, but nobody else is going to understand it because they don't have the full picture, and they have the stories that come out about you and all of this stuff. And so you have to be strong enough to just do it.
When the way we deceive ourselves is like, you're giving yourself credit for how much worse you could be or what you could get away with. You're like, look at the other people around me. They're lining their pockets. They're going along with everything. They're proposing horrible ideas.
Yeah.
And so you're seeing that. What you're not seeing is what the outside world is seeing, which is, how are you in this room at all?
Yeah.
Right? Like,
why are you there? Oh, you must be guilty too.
yes. And that like you should have left a long time ago. Right. And that is the
we
tricky
see this
part.
a lot with online stuff today, right? Like people they make snap judgments about a situation that they have a very specific lens into, and they think that what they see is all there is to see. We don't understand the nuances of all of the stuff going on. And the flip side of that is a lot of time when the nuances come out, you're like, oh my God, it's worse than I thought, right?
Well, the Upton Sinclair line is, it's very hard to get someone to understand something with their salary depends on them not understanding.
Yeah.
But I would say it's even harder to get someone to understand something that their identity depends on them not understanding. So like to go, hey, I'm going to have to resign this position, or I'm going to have to leave this political party or this religion or this class that I've been a part of and that I have a sense of myself tied up in. That's an extreme, that in a weird way, that can be scarier than, I'm going to go do this thing and I could be killed.
So I sort of talk about this a little bit in the book, right? Where we have a biological instinct towards territoriality, and like all animals do, but we're not wolves pissing on trees.
Yeah.
Our sense of territory is our identity.
Sure.
And so if you trigger something on that identity, we're going to hang on to it, and we're going to fight back, and we're not going to want to give it up. So you have a bit of loss aversion going on where like, what am I without this piece? But you also have this, I'm not even going to listen to what you're saying because you're threatening how I see myself, and more importantly, how I want other people to see me.
Yeah, have you heard that expression, you can't reason a person out of a position they didn't reason themselves into?
Yeah.
And it's really hard. Like, I think we've seen this again politically and culturally. Like, certain people think if I can just give them this information, if I can just bombard them with facts,
here's the
they'll
fact.
see it. And it's like, you don't understand that to accept this fact, to accept the truth that you're trying to express to them, you're asking them to willingly step into a reality in which they were an idiot,
Yeah.
in which they were wrong, in which they are complicit or have blood on their hands. And it takes a very strong person to do that, or it takes like a real bunker buster of a bomb that blows apart their whole life, like a criminal conviction or a divorce. It requires something so much more earth-shattering than evidence.
I think that's the opportunity, right? So if you see somebody at work or in life doing something that you wouldn't do, what it's really telling you is that they see the world in a very different way than you, because whatever they're doing is totally rational and logical to them, given all the information they have and how they think about things. And so it becomes an interesting argument, instead of giving out facts and hoping somebody's going to change their mind, to take a different approach, which is one of, tell me what the world looks like from your point of view. Like what has to be true? What do you see? What does it smell like? What's going on in your head? What are the variables that matter? Because that doesn't mean we always think that means you have to agree with the person. It doesn't. You don't have to make a judgment about right or wrong, but step into that person for a second and try to see everything they're seeing. And I guarantee you their actions are completely logical based on how they're thinking about it.
I mean, this is Socrates' idea. He says, nobody is wrong on purpose, right? Like they think that they're right. And so the Socratic method, I don't think we give it enough credit as an invention, as a way of, like, we see it as like something kind of interesting or unique, but we don't see it as like a workaround against a very timeless human problem, which is most people have assumptions that make sense to them and then viewpoints based on those assumptions. And what Socrates is doing literally in Athens, and what we now call the Socratic method, is not going around saying, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, I'm right. In fact, he doesn't usually even say what he thinks. He's asking questions, and he's asking incisive enough questions that they tend to slowly provoke the other person, his interlocutor, with the understanding that there's a contradiction or there's a faulty assumption in there. And they go, oh, okay. And that's what ultimately creates the shift, or it doesn't. And and Socrates himself now has clarity because he asked the question. But yeah, understanding that this person is in a self-contained universe where the logic makes sense and it all checks out. They're not like, yes, I saw all the facts and I am choosing to persist in error. They're saying, no, the error is in your facts. Yeah. And because of that, I think X.
Yeah. I mean, but just giving people facts isn't it almost, I've never actually seen somebody change their mind, but like here's more facts. Like if you've dug in your heels on something, what does change people's minds is sort of like the questions, but also like walk me through your understanding, because then you create a relationship where you're actually trying to understand something and you have no hidden agenda to it. And then that opens the door to be, oh, I see this particular thing differently. And that takes us on two very different paths here.
And look, great leaders, whether you're talking about Abraham Lincoln or Jesus, what they do is someone thinks X, and then they'll go, you're an idiot. Let me tell you why you're wrong. They go, let me tell you a story.
Yeah. And
that story is just vague enough that it doesn't feel even like relevant to what's happening, and you don't get it. But you're just thinking about it, and it gives you a different lens on things. And so stories, anecdotes, like we think you have your facts, let me throw other facts. That's the equivalent of one army attacking head on another army, which leads to a kind of trench warfare, which nobody ever wins. Both sides lose in a trench warfare. Maneuver warfare, or great strategic thinkers, find ways to go around. They try to outflank the opponent. They surprise the opponent. They catch the opponent unaware, right? It's all about putting strength against weakness, not strength against strength. And when people are dug in on opinions or their identity is tied up in a viewpoint, you're just setting both of you up to be unhappy by attacking it.
Going to stories, why do you think the best story wins? What is it about the power of a story that pulls people along or convinces them?
It's a good question. I mean, I think what's nice about a story is a story exists outside us. So it's like, you're saying I want to do X, and I go, let me tell you a story from my life or from history. I'm just going to tell you. I'm putting it on that screen right there, and we're both looking at it. And then you are able to go, I agree with those facts, right? Like that checks out. I took that ride. I agree with that ride. It did. I started here and now I'm here. I get it. And so that's different than me hitting you with information. And I think this is what most books do wrong, right? They're like, let me make this legal argument, but it's not.
Nobody remembers it. It's not useful. It's not pragmatic. It doesn't really, it's a good story to read, but it doesn't change behavior. It doesn't change how you see your.
It's not even a good story to read. I mean,
I like
the law is boring. Do you know what I'm saying? This math is boring, right? But when you're telling a story, I think you step outside yourself a little bit and it exists and then you accept it or you don't. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. In the book, you're talking about how we are products of our environment or our peers. And you have this quote from Epictetus, which is a great one. He's talking about how if you have a lit piece of coal, if you put an unlit piece of coal next to it, it'll either extinguish the lit piece of coal or be lit by the lit piece of coal. And the idea that we are products of our environment strikes me as a very critical Stoic idea.
I think it's Stoic. It's been true pre-Stoic, right? Like, so we are always, our environment influences us in so many different ways. And we tend to think of environment as physical, like the coal piece from Epictetus. But our environment is also our mental environment. Our environment is like who we hang around with. Our environment is so many different things that we don't think about. And so part of the book is, how do we shape our environment to make our desired behaviors our default behaviors?
Sure.
And you can do that if you think on like one level, it's like, okay, well, if you're prone to coming home and eating a bag of chips, if you create friction, you don't have chips in the house. Well, you can still get chips, but now it's a lot of work to do.
Sure.
You can do that through that's a physical sort of solution, or, not having your phone while you're doing writing, you leave it in a different spot. Now you've created this physical solution. You can do.
If you're friends with people who read a lot, you will read more, right?
Yeah.
Because you're wanting to participate in what's happening around you, and it becomes normalized. And positive and negative environments can normalize positive and negative attributes in a person.
So if you want to run, join a run club.
Yeah.
But the flip side that a lot of people don't think about is like, if you want to quit smoking, that means you're going to have to change your friends.
Yes.
Because you are not, eventually everybody loses the battle with willpower.
Yeah.
And if you're hanging around people who smoke, you're going to smoke again.
Yeah.
And so my parents went through this, and it was actually like, oddly, a weird fear of success quitting smoking that was sort of subconsciously getting in the way, because success at quitting smoking meant they had to give up every friend that they had, and they had to create new friends, and they had to go into new environment. And so it wasn't that they didn't want to quit, and they weren't consciously thinking about this, but the same thing happens. Like if you're hanging around with people, your friends are sort of like, let's say they're lazy, they watch Netflix all night, and you start going to the gym.
Yeah.
Right. Well, now not only are you going to have a new set of friends because you're not going to want to do the same things that they're doing, but you're also going to create a bit of, animosity.
It's
envy.
inherently judging or implicating that there's something wrong with the way that you used to do it, and therefore the way they are currently doing it. And that creates a tension or an isolation.
Yeah. And then you can also, so these are examples of people in your life, but if you think of creating artificial environments, you can do it through software. You can limit, your time on whatever, but you can also create artificial rules for yourself, which become environmental in a way. And one of the rules I talk about in the book is working out every day. So I got up this morning, like 5:30, I'm like down at the gym and I'm working out because I work out every day. When I tried to work out 3 days a week, I would negotiate with myself.
Because you can push it till tomorrow without saying, I'm not going to do it. Right, which is the most insidious thing. Marcus Aurelius says you could be good today, instead you choose tomorrow. When you have habits that are, sometimes I do this, it allows you to honestly lie to yourself, right?
Yeah.
Like logically lie to yourself, because you're not saying I'm never going to do it. You're saying I'm doing it tomorrow, which could be true. Versus if you go, I don't smoke anymore. Every time you smoke, you're violating that. Whereas if you say, I only smoke sometimes, well, then when you want to do it right now, you're saying this is one of those times, so it's okay.
So I was doing that, right? The little voice in my head starts negotiating with myself and is like, oh, you have a long day today. You'll do extra tomorrow. And I was trying to go 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And then I went to the gym just for information. And I was like, how often have I been here in the past year? Because they get the fob, right?
Yeah.
They gave me my swipe data, and it was like 1.5 times a week approximately.
Wow.
And so when I created the rule, you can change duration, you can change scope, but you go every day.
Yes.
You sweat every day. You don't even have to go to the gym. You can go for a run. You can,
You
but
do
you're
something
doing an
physical
activity.
hard every day,
Sometimes
yeah.
you're just in your hotel room doing push-ups and sit-ups, and like that's okay. You check that box. But that's an example of how you can shape your environment.
Yes.
Using a rule, or an automatic rule in this case, to change your desired behavior to the default behavior.
Epictetus's less politically correct encapsulation of the sort of you become like the people you're around line. He says, and I think it's okay because he himself had this. He said, if you live with a lame man, you will learn how to limp.
Yeah.
Basically, you will unconsciously pick up their habits, their, in this case, disabilities, even though you yourself don't have one, right? And that's true. You pick up the limiting beliefs of the people around you. You pick up good habits of the people around you. You're unconsciously absorbing all this stuff. So you can't really stop that, but you can decide what you put yourself around. So if like the news, negative, most of it, a lot of it not true, a lot of it not of value, you can't watch the news and filter it. Right? No one has the ability to be the sieve that separates the good stuff from the bad stuff. You have to say, I don't watch television news, and then not watch television news. And I get my information from these preferable sources. You have to you shape the physical, mental, spiritual environment so willpower is not at stake.
So we often don't think about that, right? The information we let into our head, whether it's from people in our lives or people we follow on Twitter or whatever it is, that information becomes, I guess, seed for future thoughts.
Yeah.
However, what we don't think about is like the person and to the Epictetus quote, like if there's an idiot filtering information for us, then we're getting information from an idiot by definition. Sure. And so we're eventually
from the poison tree,
right. So like who's doing the filtering? And you think about news, and I know we both have similar thoughts on sort of news, but if you have a journalist writing about 30, 40 different subjects a year, how accurate is that information going to be versus somebody who's living it and writes on the same thing over and over again? And so you think about the high quality sources of information you have and whether those people should be listened to or not.
Yeah. One of the things I took from the book, and I've taken this from your writing over the years, is what most great investors have in common is that they have rules. And those rules supersede biases, emotions, bad habits. So like you tell a story in the book of this guy, here's this great pitch and it seems interesting. He trusts but his rule is I don't invest in things that I don't know about. Yeah. Now, this may cost him that great investment.
It did.
But it saves him
totally.
The things where he has no idea, even less of an idea, and it's less vetted. So you kind of have these rules. And if you have rules about, hey, once I get home in the evening, I don't leave the house again, or I make it home in time for bedtime with my kids, or, I don't drink in bars alone, or, I don't do, like, you come up with these rules that keep you out of trouble or keep you on the straight and narrow that you want to be on. There are going to be times where it feels like an exception to that rule would be smart, pragmatic, valuable. And it's true in that case, but what you're missing is the obscured savings of all the other times that you don't even understand it saved you from.
So you can use rules to prevent you from doing something poor. And then another example in the book is you can use rules to put yourself in a position to play on easy mode or hard mode. And the position that you're in, this is something that I think a lot of people underappreciate about thinking, and about decision making is the position you're in at the time you make a decision dictates whether that's an easy decision or a hard decision, what options are available or not. So a genius in a poor position is still going to do poor, and an ordinary person in a great position is going to do really well.
Right.
And this sort of dawned on me with one of my kids who came home with, you're not at the teenager phase yet, but like he walks home and he got like this really bad mark on an exam, and he shrugs his shoulders and he like hands it to me and he knows I have to sign it, and he's like, I did my best. And I'm like, oh God. And so later on that night, I walked up to him and I was like, well, what does it mean to do your best?
Yeah.
Like, walk me through this. And I mean, it sounds pedantic, but like step by step. Well, I sat down at 10 and like, I looked at all the points on the questions. I allocated my time accordingly and I filled them out to the best of my ability. And I'm like, oh, you think about this the same way a lot of adults think about decision making.
Yeah.
I showed up at this decision.
I did my best when it was in front of me.
Yeah, but I'm like, let's rewind 96 hours here.
Yeah.
Right? Did you study? No. Did you stay up late the night before? Yes. Why did you stay up late? Because I didn't study and I decided to just like start cramming at 10:30 at night.
Right.
Did you eat a healthy breakfast? No. Why not? Because I got up late. Did you fight with your brother? Yes. Why? Because I got up late and we were like conflict in the bathroom. And I was like, so you chose to play on hard mode. And I use hard mode, easy mode with the kids, but like that is an example of poor positioning and how that impacts your decisions. And so one of the counterintuitive insights about thinking and decision making is that the best in the world are rarely forced by circumstances into doing something they don't want to do.
Yes.
And the way they do that is they're always operating from a position of strength.
Yeah. You're basically what you're teaching your kid there is downstream consequences, which we were talking about, but you're going, hey, you're seeing this test as the test itself.
Yeah.
And actually the failure of the test was determined by the decisions you made the day before and the week before and the month before. And so it's insufficient and it's self-deceiving to say, I did my best. Yes, you did your best with what you were able to bring to the table, but you could have brought a lot more to the table. And I think you can also go as a parent, I could have intervened earlier and been helpful to you, so like we're both sharing this, right? But you're saying basically if we had made better decisions earlier, you would have been set up for success. My wife and I talk about that all the time. Like it's not like by the time there is the tantrum or the fight or the problem, a bunch of decisions have been made that made that more or less likely. And your job as a parent is not just to go, what you're doing right now is not okay. Your job as a parent, just like your job is as a leader or your job as a person with yourself, is to set people and things up for success, right? To set yourself up. When you step in front of the mirror and you don't like what you see, well, you didn't set yourself up to like what you see because you were making bad decisions for the previous 6 months.
And this is what I think most people who've tackled this subject, which we talked about earlier being hard, is the way that they approach it is here's how to be more rational.
Yeah.
And that is, there's books filled with how to be more rational and, fill out spreadsheets and do all this stuff. And nobody does that in the real world. And it's not that we're incapable of being rational. It's that we're put into situations that are predictable where we're not going to be rational. We're going to react without reasoning. And that we don't think about sort of the 96 hours before the moment.
Yeah.
And I think of positioning and preparation as two different things. Preparation is I know the future, I can anticipate it, and I can sort of like have a big dramatic influence over it. Like I can anticipate my boss is retiring in 4 months, so I'm going to prepare to take on that role.
Yes.
That's different than positioning, which is like, I might lose my job tomorrow. How do I save money? How do I develop the skills that are going to help me land another job? I don't know what the future holds, but no matter if I do both of those things, it's only good news for me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like you're like, hey, I want to be smarter. I want to make better decisions. So you're reading a decision-making book or you're cramming your brain with all this knowledge. But it's like, well, what if you just focused on being less stupid? And one of those ways might be like sleeping well or drinking less or whatever, right? So it doesn't seem like it pertains to how do I make sure I don't blow this important decision about whether I go this way or that way. And actually, the best way to do that would have been to go to bed earlier the night before or to not be one of these people that's like burning the midnight oil and then taking Ambien to go to sleep and then uppers to be like, you're expecting a rationality that is physically impossible in your case.
You're playing on hard mode.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, you're playing on hard mode.
So you can't change the fact that you're going to encounter these circumstances, but you can change the person that you bring to the circumstances.
Yes, sure.
And you do that through simple things like no judgment if people want to drink but don't do it on a day before you have a big presentation, right? Sure. Like you're just putting yourself in a position where there's no points for difficulty in any of this stuff.
Yeah. Nobody is judging. Nobody is going, hey, actually, I need to grade them on a curve because I know all of these factors were
they were out drinking last night. They got into a fight with their
wife.
Like whatever.
Did you make the game was on the line and the ball came in your hands? Did the shot go in or not?
Yeah.
They don't care. Like, oh, well, he's been dating a lot and so he hasn't been staying at home and blah blah blah. It's like nobody gives a shit, right? And so you have to make decisions that set you up for success.
And this is where it gets super interesting because it's like, it's controllable. Mm-hmm. I don't need somebody else to tell me. I can look at the things in my life where I can do simple things that will compound over time. And my position just gets increasingly strong. And now I'm creating contrast with other people.
Sure.
That contrast gives me more opportunities. And those opportunities turn into a cumulative advantage.
Yeah, it's like, look, I'd like to eliminate my temper. I'd like to control my emotions. These are impossible things to ask of yourself. So what you're really asking is like, I want to make less emotional decisions. I want to say less things that I regret, right? Your problem with your temper or your emotions is really what the consequences of those are. So then if you put a simple rule and you go like, hey, I don't respond to emails right away, or I'm going to tell this person I'm going to wait 24 hours. Like by putting in a buffer, you're just ensuring that most likely that emotion or that heat of the moment will have lessened with time. So you create these rules or these practices. It would be easier. It would be wonderful if you could just magically turn these negative things off. Probably unlikely. What you want to do is set aside practices or systems that mitigate or lessen the potential influence that those things are going to have on you in the big moments.
And I think, mutual friend Belichick, who's like, you have to avoid, they're doing a terrible job of it this year, but you have to avoid losing before you can win.
Yes.
And I think that we don't think about that. And if you look at like some of the exemplars that we hold up as, captains of industry, if you will, or, sort of like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Warren Buffett, they just don't really lose that much. And they're never in a position where they're scrambling for survival. I mean, Carnegie made most of his fortune in the 1870s after the financial panic when he bought out his partners at the steel mill because they were levered. And he didn't know steel was going to become what Carnegie Steel became.
Yeah.
But that's how he got this advantage from it. He just avoided losing. And how did he avoid losing? Well, he didn't lever himself up to the hilts.
Yeah.
And he didn't know that there was this is the interesting thing. He didn't know there was a financial crisis coming. He just knew that financial crisis come. I can't time it. Nobody's going to give me a warning. They're not going to tell me to go home and be like, hey, you got 2 weeks. But it's like that with life, right? With relationships, with emotional, with financial, with losing your job, you often don't have that sort of warning. And so you always, I don't think you have to be prepared. I think you have to be positioned to sort of pivot and have a lot of optionality with what's going on so that it's not the end of the world and you can take advantage of the situation.
I think about like on a very simple level, like why do CEOs, very busy, important people, like why do they work out very early in the morning? The reason they work out very early in the morning is because days are unpredictable. Mm-hmm. So something could intervene that prevents you from getting to the gym at 4, or could intervene from you getting to the gym when you get free, right? And so if I run in the morning and I cross it off the list, there's no chance of it not happening because it already happened. I did it first, I crossed it off the list. So like for me, I try to work out usually in the mornings. I try to do my writing before I do other things. I front load the stuff so then I am less exposed to the volatility or the unpredictability of the day. I already got it done, so everything else I get done is extra, as opposed to, well, I'm going to do these other things that are less important first. And then when I get around to it, I'm going to do these other things that are actually important. And so thinking about it that way, that doesn't seem like much. Like, oh, they work out in the morning or work out in the morning. Doesn't seem like a great insight, but it's actually it's a statement of priorities, and also it's a hedge. There's a humility to it. There's going, hey, the days tend to get away from us. We are not in control. Life tends to intervene. So when it is in my power, I get it done. I cross it off first, and therefore I am less at the mercy of events.
I can't argue with any of that. I think that makes a ton of sense, right?
Yeah.
So I don't work out usually in the morning. I have to work out every day. So
Yeah.
this was the time today. Yeah. I usually work out at like noon. So it's a transition between first part of my day, which is like all blank, no meetings, work out at noon, and then it's all. And I find I'm better in these meetings, more attentive, more alert, less prone to sort of like the emotional ups and downs of whatever's going on if I've worked out.
Yeah.
And so I'm putting myself in a better position to handle them. I'm not changing the fact that they're coming.
Yeah.
And if I rely on willpower, which would be like for me going at 5 or 4 or 6 or whatever time, I'd find it much harder to go on a consistent basis because that was what I was doing before. And then that little voice in your head starts chirping and negotiating with yourself about, do extra tomorrow. You don't need it. You're tired. And when these days turn into weeks and weeks into months, like that becomes your position. That becomes your sort of like the state that you're operating in.
I interviewed this novelist, Philip Meyer, and he was saying, he's like, you got to be really aware of what you give the best part of your day to.
Yeah. Right.
And so it's like if the Stoic observation in Seneca goes like, why are you giving philosophy the leftover you?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like your work, you're doing all this other stuff, and then you go, oh, if I have a few minutes at the end, then I'll do it. But you might not.
What do we do with like most lives? We give our kids, our partner, the worst.
The leftover, right? After the end of the day, when you're tired, when you're frustrated, when things have accumulated, you've been texting or, you're not setting yourself up for success, right? And it's better to get the win and then have extra as opposed to do all these other things and then hope it goes exactly as you want it to go.
And the other thing we don't do, if you think of positioning also applies to your relationships with people. If you and your partner are investing in your relationship and something happens.
Yeah.
But because you've been investing in it, my friend Peter Kaufman has this expression. He's like, imagine a patch of grass between you and your partner.
Yeah.
And if you water that grass every day and a spark falls on it, it's just going to go out.
Sure.
But if you don't water that grass, it's going to dry out. And then that spark turns into a fire. And it's like, well, what is investing? It looks boring, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like date nights.
Sure.
It's like communicating with each other and connecting. It's talking about each other's day.
Sure.
All the stuff that you're like, oh, in the moment, these things I can easily let slip by and not do. And I don't think of them and how they aggregate to the position I'm in when there's inevitable sort of trouble in our relationship, which is going to come. We know it's going to come. But we can change the position we're in when it does come based on how we act and what we do today.
Who is Peter Kaufman, by the way? Because you probably thanked him or you mentioned him in 50 footnotes.
Yeah. He's the CEO of a company called Glenair out in Glendale, California.
Okay.
And he became a good friend over the last, 5-8 years. And just through many conversations with him, a lot of these ideas are his in terms of the biological connection between us being self-preserving and territorial, and he's got a unique way of insights. So a lot of the conversations that we've had crop up in the book with sort of how he approaches things or thinks about them, and I find them really advantageous to. Interesting. What do you think?
No, interesting. Yeah. It seems like you got I'm fascinated by this relationship between Seneca and his friend Lucilius. Yeah. Like Seneca's letters are the letters he and his friend are writing back and forth. And they're not like, oh, today I had, dinner. And it's this kind of ongoing accountability relationship that they have with each other. Seneca says the point of it is like they should each be trying to give each other like one thing a day, right? And so the letters that survive are obviously the better things, but he's like, oh, I learned this or I saw this. And he's basically saying like the path to wisdom, the path to being a philosopher is like just acquiring like one thing a day. And so having these kind of these intellectual relationships where you're sharing things, you're kicking things back and forth, you're going, hey, I'm doing this, or I thought about this. And then it's just the accumulated wisdom or insights that come from that exchange. It's so valuable to us as a person. I mean, it was so valuable then that 2,000 years later, we're still like, we're basking in the glow of the fire, that the friction between Seneca and Lucilius, kicked off.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important that we have those relationships.
What I love is sort of getting able to talk to these people is amazing, and it's byproduct of having a platform. But when things triangulate, and across different industries and across different people and across different generations, oh, this person's talking about this. It's the same as this, which is the same as this. There's a lot of signal in that now that I've triangulated it across.
You're identifying patterns.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the idea with the book was like, what can I triangulate? What can I pull out from what I've learned over the past 15 or 20 years on this particular subject? And how do I reconcile the language? Because the language is always different between everybody.
Right.
But they're talking about very similar, the same things.
What is phronesis?
So that's the concept the ancient Greeks had about ordering your life to get the results you want. And it relates to positioning a lot, right? It relates to a lot of what we're talking about in the book, in the sense of, how do I get what I want? How do I want what's worth getting? How do I put myself in a position where I get both of those things?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you could kind of define it as like, it's the synthesis of knowledge into actionable ideas.
Well, you have to apply the knowledge that you have. You have to be able to, what good is knowledge just for the sake of knowledge if it doesn't make the world a better place, if it doesn't, and we might think differently on this, right? But if you can't use it to sort of get to a better result, a better outcome, not only better for your family, but better for your community and better for your country and better for the world writ large.
Yeah, what are you going to do with this information is a question that I think people don't ask themselves enough.
Yeah, you can't.
This is trivia if you're not going to use it in some way.
And this prevents us from taking action all the time, right? Like we get knowledge, we talk about knowledge, and we don't put it into practice, and we get sort of reinforced for talking about it, but we don't actually do anything. And I think that that's just like a poison.
Well, a good example of this is inside companies is like reports. People are tasked with spending a lot of time organizing information, putting it into graphs or in presentations or reports or whatever. And then very rarely is the leadership who is asking for that information evaluating how much and where they're using it. And so like, I think it was the founder of Patagonia had some rule about how a report should take 15 minutes to make and 5 minutes to read, right? And so whenever I get information or reports from, I go like, how long does this take you to make? Because I'm sensing that you are putting more into it than I am putting into getting something out of it. And so to go like, hey, only give me the information that I'm actually going to use. And by the way, like, think about information that I would use, like seek out information that I'm going to like, so when I do a podcast, I have someone sort of prep stuff for me. It's like you giving me their bio. Like, I'm not going to ask them about where they went to high school. So don't give me that information. But you to tell me that, hey, they actually just had a cancer scare. That might be something I every time I train someone new to do the job, because it's usually kind of an entry level job, I'm going, think about a context in which this could conceivably come up. And if you can't think of that context, it's worthless information. And the fact that you put it together, I'm not giving you credit for how long the email you sent me is. I'm only going to think, hey, I formulated a lot of questions based on the information you gave me. Or we talked at length about information that I got from that report. And this is true also for sales data. Like, just you're paying someone to spin their wheels, and then you're not, what is the point of that?
It's make work, it's not visible to you, and there's a judgment problem, if you will, which is like, you want somebody to apply judgment, and how you respond to them applying that judgment is going to dictate whether they apply judgment or not. This is why most organizations work on policies and procedures, because if I follow the policy, even though I know it's wrong, you can't hold me accountable. Right. Whereas if I'm applying judgment on a daily basis and it's very subjective, well, now there's a fear involved in that. And you also get to a map territory problem with reporting, right? Where you're reporting what the map is, but what you want to see is what the territory is. You want to touch the medium. You want to see if the road moved. You don't want to just see here's the map from like 5 years ago. And so you might be looking at all these variables while your business is going off the rails. And you can't tell because you didn't anticipate some of the variables or how they interact, where you want that person to apply the judgment to be like, hey, this is not looking right. Like, we want to talk about this. And this is why a lot of businesses go off the rails. Their metrics are going well, but their territory is eroding. And then what happens is the CEO, the manager, the team leader, if they're not touching the territory and they're only touching the map, they don't know the morale. They don't know what's happening in the factory floor. They don't know, even if they see the metrics, they don't really know what's happening in the business.
Yeah, and conversely, like, managing up is important, right? So if you're an employee, you have to have the sort of theory of mind, the empathy to be able to go, my boss is doing this presentation and he or she has asked me to, do X, Y, or Z for that presentation. How is what I'm doing giving them actionable? How is this fitting into, first off, what are they actually doing? What does that look like? And then you back out what you do from there, not, well, it was easiest for me to put it in this Excel document or what, like, right? Like, you're not thinking about the context in which you are trying to provide help or service or value. And so it's unlikely that what you're doing is of service or value. And the artists make this mistake all the time. Authors sit down and they write a book that's interesting to them, but they haven't stopped and thought about the person who's picking up and reading it. What problem is it solving for them? How are they engaging with it? How are they discovering it? How are they hearing about it? What is the reaction they're having to the text? All these kinds of understanding that ultimately it's not what it is to you, it's what it is to them. Like, it's you're making it for someone else. If you're not making it for someone else, be honest with yourself that this is a
book for me,
a personal project. But by definition of signing with a publisher or an art gallery or whatever, you are making this for an audience. So you have to at some point consider that audience and their needs, or you are hoping to hit a target that you do not see.
Yeah, I think that's true, right? Like, you should be doing that with everything that you're doing, though. But the risk that people don't want to do with that is, and I talk about this a little bit in the book with identifying the most important thing, is you're putting yourself in a position where you could be wrong. So I'm going to exercise judgment. I'm going to try to give Ryan, above and beyond what's expected. Well, now I might be wrong. And I don't want to put myself in that situation because we're not used to operating in those environments where we can be wrong. And it sort of goes back to a little bit of what we talked about earlier, about having the strength to be in a position where you can handle it emotionally if you are wrong, or you as a boss can give feedback and be like, oh, I love that you did this. I see the extra effort. We got to turn it like 5 degrees to the right here or something.
Although I have found, again, to go to managing up, I have never experienced as an employee or a boss a problem where the person asked too many questions about what you wanted. Do you know what I mean? When you're like, hey, can you do this? Like, there's this famous scene in The Office where Jim is asked to make a rundown for the new boss. He's like, can you give me a rundown on your sales? And he doesn't know what a rundown is. And it's funny because he can't figure it out. But it's like at no point does it occur to him to go, what is a rundown? Right? As if the boss would be upset, right? Like, because he doesn't want to admit that he doesn't know what a rundown is. And that is, I think, an encapsulation of where sort of ego and insecurity causes so many problems. You can't learn what you think you already know is Seneca or is Epictetus' line, but also you can't learn what you're afraid to ask about, right? And so, like, as a person who is working with other people, you're much more likely to get in trouble or to cause problems by what you don't ask for specificity or further instruction about than you are to ask too many questions to dial in exactly what they're looking for.
But so that's another example from the book, right? When our ego is in charge, and our ego is in charge when we respond there.
Yeah.
Because we're responding by not asking the question about like, what does this mean? Or, I forgot
Do you want it
this,
more
or,
like this? Do you like it long? Do you like it short? Do you want an email? Do you want an attachment?
That's our ego at work, right? And we don't want to admit that we might not know something. And so in those situations, we're more prone to reacting, not reasoning.
Yeah.
So how do you put yourself in a position? And if you're a boss, how do you put your employee in a position?
Ease, or
right. So that
sure.
comes to a little bit of psychological safety,
sure.
But it comes to your relationship with that person too, in terms of, is this a transaction? Is this more than that? How are we operating together? How much time have we spent together? So you can put yourself in a position where people will feel more comfortable.
Sure.
Doesn't mean they're going to do it, but it does make it a lot easier to do the desired behavior in the moment, which is admit. And you can do that as a boss. You can model that, which also helps with the psychological safety and the positioning.
Keep going.
So I just think it's really interesting to think about. You think about emotion, and you think about ego, and you think about social defaults and inertia. And these are situations that just tend to think for us.
Yeah.
And yes, we can have willpower, and we can be like, I recognize I'm getting angry, I'm going to leave the room. And that might work like 20% of the time. But are there other things that we can do to avoid that? Like turning off the computer at night, after a long day when I'm more prone to sort of like these outbursts, not drinking, sleeping well, working out. Yes. We're putting ourselves in a position where we can deal with that anger in a different way. But you can think of something like that where we can put ourselves in a position where
people are not afraid to ask.
We're creating a culture for our company, where we're creating a culture for our relationship where you feel safe to do that.
But it's always funny, right? When
it's
you
like me admitting that I have dyslexia like 5 minutes ago.
But it's like people don't want to. They're like, oh, I didn't want to bother you, right? Or I didn't want to look dumb. And it's like, how do you think you look now? How do you think this thing I've been waiting 3 weeks for coming in not the way that I want it is? Do you think that's like so it is funny the way that we don't want to do like a small hard thing.
Yeah. It's first
to
order
avoid a much more hard thing later.
Well, it's first order negative, second order positive, right? So if we do the first order negative thing, which is like admit we forgot it, we don't know, like what are you talking
delivering
about?
Bad news.
Right. But the second order to that is super positive because now you get a report that nails it. You get what you want in the end.
Prevented the bad outcome.
So we're only thinking at the first level, and if we think 2 or 3 levels deep, we would rationally come to the conclusion that this little pain now is worth going through because it's going to save us this big pain later.
Totally.
But again, that comes down to like being more rational. Is we know how to think like that.
Yeah.
And so the example that I sort of use with people is if you're in a fight with your partner and you're arguing about the dishwasher, and it's like slowly escalating, and I'm watching, and I tap you on the shoulder, and I'm like, Ryan, do you want to put gas or water on this situation? You're going to be like, water.
Yeah.
But what I've done, because it's not that you're not rational.
Interrupted it. Yeah.
I interrupted this sort of response that you're having where you're reacting without reasoning. And so
you say in the book, you say that's something you ask your kids, which I thought was great. You're saying like, is the behavior you're doing making the outcome more or less likely? I say that to my son. It's like, okay, look, we took the iPad away and you want the iPad back. You freaking out and acting insane and hurting your brother, saying, or you doing this, do you think that's making me more or less likely to give it to you later? Yeah. And then how do you think it's changing my understanding or the relationship of the iPad in our house as a whole, right?
Yeah.
And so the ability to sort of go, hey, think about the choices that you're making right now and how they pertain to where you want to be or what you want is a super important skill. And the ability to interrupt a cycle or a downward spiral is like the master skill, right? The ability to deal with frustration, to catch yourself, to not make a bad situation worse. I mean, if you can just start figuring that out at 7 instead of starting At 27, when it's been a continual process, it's just an enormous advantage.
So I do this with the kids too, right? It's the first mistake doesn't kill you. It's like the cover up that kills you.
Sure.
So it's like, are you lying to me? You have a pivot point here. I know what's happened. They don't know that I know.
Yeah.
But I'm like, the choice you make right now is going to make this situation better or worse.
Yes.
And you choose, and then they'll think, you can like literally see them thinking about it. And they're like, what are the odds I get away with this thing? Right.
Sure.
And then they ultimately almost always tell me the truth.
Yes.
And it's the same with us, right? The first mistake doesn't do us in. It's always the second, third, fourth mistake, because what happens after the first mistake, we make another mistake. Well, what's really happening is our position's eroding. It's increasingly becoming harder and harder and harder to get the desired result that we want.
Yeah.
And then it becomes impossible at some point. It's kind of like playing Tetris, right? You make one mistake, it's like, oh shit.
You can maybe pull out of that, but you can't make 5 mistakes. It's not salvageable.
And then you need just the perfect piece, right? To start getting out of this. And, you can think of that sediment or accumulation like that.
I try to tell my son that too. I go like, when have you ever faced serious consequences? Like you're afraid to tell me the truth as if like I'm beating you. You know what I mean? As if I'm this cruel, like authoritarian dictator. It's like, dude, the stakes here are so incredibly low and the upside is high. But it's almost just a natural human thing to just like
totally.
I realize like what we realized, like going like, okay, actually objectively he must understand the stakes here are pretty low. Like he's not choosing between, if I tell him the truth, I'm not going to get to do like, so it's what is the factor then that's acting on his logic? It's shame. So it's an internal feeling and going, oh, okay, so this actually has nothing to do with us. This has something to do with you. So now how do I talk to you and present it to you in a way that your shame is not triggered? And how do I give you an awareness that shame is part of the equation for you? So you're aware that you have that bias or that tendency, and then you don't let it take you to a place where, it doesn't work out for you.
Yeah. I think that, there's nothing to say to that. Going back to the gas water thing just for a second, I find with the kids, I rarely tell them what to do. There's like an exception to that. But like when they because I have 2 and they're 14 months apart. So they like.
Very close, yeah.
And I just like interrupt them and I'm like, gas or water.
That's great. So good.
And in that moment, I never tell them to choose water.
Sure.
Right?
But it's obvious. It's rhetorical.
No, sometimes they actually choose gas. Like they're like, okay.
No, but I mean, the answer is obvious, right? Like we know, we don't always do it, but we know we don't want to make a bad situation worse.
But from a parenting perspective, it's been helpful because they actually call each other out on it in a weird way. Because they're like
little mantra, sure.
They're sort of like, young teens, and one of them will like punch the other one lightly and then be like gas or water sort of thing. But when we're out in public and they're doing something that's escalating, I can just say water. And I don't have to like point out, I don't have to embarrass them, I don't have to call them out. And then it's a cue for them to be like, this is not getting me the outcome that I want. This is not moving me closer to the things that I want. I'm going to take a different path here and try to.
Well, not to mix metaphors, but gas or water is an off-ramp. Right? Like I don't, just because it started to go this way doesn't mean I have to keep doing it. I can go the other direction. I can stop. I can interrupt. And the ability to do that is kind of a superpower.
Yeah. I think like it's great too. One of my kids came home the other day, he skipped his extracurricular activities and he has to do these as part of school. And he's like,
so they're not extracurricular.
Well, it is. It's just part of his school, right? And he came home and I was like, what are you doing home? And he's like, well, it was confusing. I thought I sort of like got kicked out of this class, but I wasn't quite sure. And I'm like, you need to decide in this moment, is this getting you closer to your graduation or farther away?
Sure.
And then you need to go back to school and you need to fix this. And he's like, what? I was like, put your uniform on, get your butt back to school and like fix this situation. He's like, I don't know how. I'm like, well, what outcome do you want? Who do you need to talk to? And what do you think you should say to them?
Yeah.
And then he's like, okay, I'll do that.
Yeah, or to even just to go, hey, I did this thing. I don't know how to fix it.
Yeah.
I need help fixing it, right? As opposed to, I'm going to either persist in the error or I'm going to let shame make me hide the error to be able to go like, I worked myself into a corner. Like think about how often this happens in companies, right? Like you make a mistake, you make a bad call, and then you're just
You want to cover it up.
Sitting on it, you're hoping it magically resolves itself
Yeah.
when actually intervention at some point could have saved you.
How often does it like magically save itself?
Never. It never
Exactly.
does. It never does. So you end the book with a kind of a memento mori, right?
I like the Scrooge example. I think
Yes.
that's like so pressing for people, right? Which is like, if you let society unconsciously tell you what to pursue, what happens?
Yeah.
And, you think you want money, status, power. And who do we know that got all of those things?
Yeah.
Well, fictional character Ebenezer Scrooge. I know lots of real life people who get the same thing. And then what do they want at the end of their life? They just want a do-over. And
Yeah.
we talked about this at the beginning, because the way that they accomplish these things is mutually exclusive from living a life of meaning, mutually exclusive from the type of person that they want to be, the type of person they want to be remembered for. And I sort of think about, okay, well, you can imagine your death, right?
Yeah.
And so close your eyes. You're sort of in the hospital. It's your last night. You're in a coma. You're surrounded by people. And what are they saying about you? And what do you want them to be saying about you? And now look at how you're living your life. And are you living your life in a way that is most likely to lead to that outcome? Or are there changes that you need to make? And again, no judgment about what people pursue. I really, I love the fact that people pursue different things.
Sure.
What I really want is for people to be conscious of what they're pursuing and the way that they're pursuing it.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny how timeless that sort of exercise or that insight is. I mean, A Christmas Story is what, mid-1800s?
Yeah.
In Meditations, Marcus Aurelius says, he does this thought exercise to himself. He's like, consider your life is over. He's like, you've lived your whole life. You just found out you've died. And then he's like, okay, now take what's left and live it properly.
Yeah.
I love his implication is you've died, take stock, or you're dying or you've died, take stock of your life. And then he says, now take what's left and live it properly. The implication being you can't possibly do that exercise and be fully satisfied with the choices you've made, the direction you're going, the assumptions you're believing. But when you look at the present moment in light of or from the point of view of a dying person, you immediately go, I'm fixing this, and this. And you have the chance to do that right now because you're not dying, but you're not dying. And so you have the chance to course correct before it's too late.
And what you're really doing is you're changing your perspective.
Yeah.
Right? And your
You're
perspective,
zooming way out.
so what you see is what you get. That's our default perspective. But you change your perspective, you change your lens into the situation. Now all of a sudden you can see things you couldn't see before. That can also apply to so many other aspects of your life and decision making. It gives you different lenses into a problem to think like, how would Ryan think about this? What would Ryan see? What would Ryan consider important? But importantly, you can also, it doesn't have to be about death. You can be like, if I were to take over my life today, I fired myself.
Yeah.
I'm starting from
New
scratch.
management. Yeah.
A new management comes in tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
What's working? What's not working? What am I going to do differently? And now I've changed the perspective on the situation that I'm currently living. And so you can think forward in terms of like death, but you can also think in the present moment about like, what are the things that I'm wasting time on that are ineffective that I would really be like, if I think Rogan had that thing about a video camera following him around all day or something. And if a video camera was documenting your success, what would you be proud of them seeing and what would you want to hide from them? And if you're trying to hide something from them, then maybe that's an indication that you shouldn't be doing that, or you should limit your time. You're not going to want them to, record you flipping through Instagram for an hour every night on the couch.
Yeah.
You're going to be like, no, because that doesn't lead to success, right? They're documenting your success. And so I find those really interesting perspective changes, not only for how you're living life and where you're going, but also for the present moment about what am I doing? What can I do differently tomorrow specifically? Not in terms of my relationships or the destination, but in terms of my actions about other things. Like, what am I doing that's a waste of time? Yeah. What would I cancel? Which projects would I take off my plate?
No, and I think that's what philosophy is. That's what sort of what you talk about at Farnam Street is just those shifts create changes in behavior and perspectives that make you better. And they doing them often, doing them consistently over a long period of time has the ability to transform your life because the impact might be small in each individual instance, but cumulatively the impact is very, very large.
Totally. And that's what we miss, right? Because we're looking for these big impacts, these big wins, these overnight
the
successes.
epiphanies. Yes.
Because and I have a saying, which is a lack of patience changes the outcome. And so when we want the outcome, when we know how to get the outcome and we try to get it quicker than is otherwise natural, we change the fact that we're going to get the outcome, or we dramatically reduce the odds. And if you think of financial freedom being an example, well, we know from history, the most likely path to financial freedom is to save more money. And to invest that money, dollar cost average it into a low cost index fund, and then wait a really fucking long period of time. And we all know that works. And then we all try to outsmart it. And most of what we're doing when we try to outsmart it is not necessarily to get a bigger pile. It's to change the timeline under which that happened. So it's like, I'm going to go all in on Bitcoin. Why are you doing that? I'm just going to make a lot of money, and then I'm going to get out and I'm going to change my behavior and, do the other thing.
You're not.
But now I don't have the patience. So it's the lack of patience that sort of changes that outcome.
Well, awesome, man. This was great.
Thanks, dude. It's a fun conversation.